Hello there, weary traveler, and welcome back to this cozy corner of history where we explore the stories that time tried to bury. Tonight, we're journeying to medieval England to witness one of history's most deceptively deadly activities. How getting a simple haircut could become your final earthly act, and why the same blade that trimmed your hair for your wedding day might have just amputated a diseased limb moments before. Whether you're nestled under warm blankets ready to drift off to sleep, or simply seeking to unwind with some gentle historical storytelling, I'm so grateful you've chosen to spend this evening with me. If you don't mind, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from tonight, and what time of day it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. It's always such a comfort to see our community of history enthusiasts gathered here from every corner of the globe. And if you find peace in these calm, immersive tales from ages past, go ahead and click that subscribe button so you don't miss our next journey together. But for now, let's allow the gentle weight of modern comfort to settle around you as we travel back to a time when something as simple as trimming your hair could seal your fate in ways that medieval people could never imagine. Tonight, we're entering the world of Barber-Surgeons, those dual practitioners who emerged around 1000 Anno Domini and dominated European medical care for centuries, wielding the same contaminated tools for haircuts that they used for amputations, tooth extractions, and surgical procedures. Picture yourself settling deeper into your pillow as we begin this tale based on documented historical realities of medieval medical practice. Close your eyes if you wish, and let your breathing slow as we explore together what it truly meant to place your life in the hands of someone whose medical training consisted entirely of apprenticeship and tradition, operating in a world where the very concept of microscopic organisms causing disease was still centuries away from discovery. Take a deep breath with me now, feeling the softness of your bedding, the warmth of your room, the safety of your walls. Hold on to that comfort as we journey back to the documented reality of medieval medicine, where historical records show us the terrifying truth that in an era when barber-surgeons performed everything from simple grooming to complex surgery with no understanding of infection control, even the most routine procedures carried risks that would horrify modern medical practitioners. The historical evidence paints a picture that seems almost unbelievable to our modern understanding. Let your breathing slow as we consider the documented reality that barber-surgeons, first recognized around 1000 AD, operated under a medical system where the same razor used to trim hair might have been used moments before to lance an infected wound, extract a diseased tooth, or perform an amputation, all without any cleaning beyond wiping on a cloth that itself became a repository for dangerous microorganisms. Rest comfortable in your knowledge of sterile medical procedures as we examine the historical records that document how the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 fundamentally changed European medical practice. This papal edict forbade physicians, most of whom were clergy, from performing surgical procedures, as contact with blood or body fluids was viewed as contaminating to men of the church. As a result, surgical procedures were relegated to craft status, with training conducted through apprenticeships in trade guilds rather than formal medical education. Feel grateful for your understanding of cross-contamination as we explore what this meant in practical terms. Historical documents show us that barber-surgeons were expected to handle an enormous range of medical procedures with their basic grooming tools. These practitioners performed bloodletting to balance the bodily humors, extracted infected teeth with the same pliers they used for other purposes, lanced boils and abscesses, set broken bones, treated wounds, and performed amputations, all in addition to their primary trade of cutting hair and shaving beards. The surgical mortality rates documented from this period tell a sobering story. Breathe deeply of your modern medical safety as we consider the evidence. Surgical mortality was extraordinarily high due to blood loss, shock, and infection. Yet the medical theory of the time actually encouraged many of these dangerous practices. Physicians believed that bloodletting would improve health by balancing the body's humors, so barber-surgeons regularly used contaminated bloodletting razors and applied leeches that had been used on previous patients. Let your mind rest in the comfort of modern antiseptic understanding as we examine documented cases from the era. The records of Joseph Binns, a London surgeon who practiced from 1633 to 1663, provide us with concrete data about medical outcomes from this period. Of 616 documented patient cases, Binns recorded that 53 patients, fully 8%, died from their procedures. This death rate occurred despite Binns being considered a skilled practitioner of his time and his work coming after significant advances in surgical technique that were not available in the earlier medieval period. These mortality statistics become even more sobering when we consider that Binns was working in the 17th century, well after many medical advances had begun to improve surgical outcomes. Feel thankful for your sterile medical environment, as we realize that medieval barber surgeons, working centuries earlier with even more primitive understanding and techniques, would have faced mortality rates significantly higher than Binns' already alarming 8% death rate. The historical evidence shows us that medieval understanding of disease causation made proper hygiene seem not just unnecessary, but potentially harmful. Rest in your knowledge of germ theory as we explore how the dominant medical theory, inherited from the ancient Greek physician Galen, held that illness was caused by imbalances in the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, rather than by external infectious agents. This theoretical framework had profound implications for medical practice. Breathe easily in your understanding of bacteria and viruses as we consider how medieval physicians actually believed that exposure to corrupted matter could help balance the humors and strengthen the body's constitution. Some medical authorities even argued that excessive cleanliness could weaken a person by preventing their body from developing resistance to disease. This backwards understanding meant that a barber surgeon's contaminated shop was seen as evidence of experience and effectiveness rather than a danger to customers. The tools of the medieval barber surgeon's trade were themselves repositories of infection. Let your breathing slow as we examine the historical evidence about these instruments. Razors were sharpened on communal whetstones that accumulated bacteria from countless previous uses. Shears were maintained with animal fats that could turn rancid and harbor dangerous microorganisms. Basins used to catch blood during medical procedures were cleaned only by wiping them with cloths that themselves became contaminated. Feel grateful for your modern understanding of metallurgy and sterilization as we consider the materials available to medieval practitioners. Iron tools rusted easily, developing pitted surfaces that provided ideal environments for bacterial growth. Bronze and copper instruments were softer metals that could become contaminated during the sharpening process. Wooden handles absorbed bodily fluids and were impossible to clean thoroughly. Even the best-crafted instruments of the period would be considered dangerously contaminated by modern medical standards. The apprenticeship system that trained medieval barber surgeons created a self-perpetuating cycle of dangerous practices. Rest comfortable in your evidence-based medical education as we observe how these practitioners learned their craft through observation and tradition rather than scientific study. They memorized the locations of major blood vessels and learned the basic techniques for various procedures, but they had no understanding of the microscopic world that made their work so hazardous to their patients. The economic structure of medieval society made these dangerous practices even more widespread. Breathe deeply of your accessible healthcare as we consider how the guild system that governed barber surgeons actually worked against improvements in safety and hygiene. Master barber surgeons taught their apprentices exactly the same techniques they had learned decades earlier, viewing any deviation from traditional methods as dangerous innovation rather than potential improvement. Historical records show us that soap was expensive and difficult to obtain, requiring animal fat and ash that had to be processed through time-consuming procedures. Feel thankful for your abundant clean water, as we learn that even basic cleaning supplies like clean cloths were luxury items that many barber-surgeons simply couldn't afford to use and discard regularly. The economic pressures of the trade meant that practitioners needed to see as many customers as possible each day to make a living, leaving little time for careful cleaning between patients. The broader context of medieval life created additional challenges that increased the risks of contamination during grooming procedures. Let your mind rest in the safety of your modern environment as we examine the documented realities of medieval hygiene and health. Historical evidence shows us that head lice were nearly universal among all social classes, skin diseases were extremely common, and untreated wounds often festered for weeks before professional attention was sought. This meant that even the most well-intentioned barber surgeon was constantly exposed to a variety of pathogens that accumulated on tools and hands throughout the day. Rest in your understanding of disease transmission as we consider how the same instruments might be used on a diseased beggar in the morning and a wealthy merchant's son in the afternoon, with no understanding that infection could pass between social classes through contaminated tools. The religious and philosophical context of medieval medicine also worked against improvements in hygiene. Feel grateful for your secular, science-based medical care as we explore how medieval medical practitioners sometimes saw illness as divine punishment for sin, making aggressive treatment seem presumptuous or even blasphemous. Others held that suffering was spiritually beneficial, discouraging efforts to prevent or quickly cure infections. The seasonal patterns of medieval life created periods of heightened vulnerability that coincided with increased demand for grooming services. Breathe easily in your climate-controlled environment as we learn how late winter and early spring, when stored food supplies were running low and fresh vegetables were not yet available, saw spikes in deaths from infected wounds and surgical procedures. The nutritional deficiencies that resulted from seasonal food shortages weakened immune systems, precisely when people were most likely to seek grooming services in preparation for spring weddings and religious festivals. Historical records document specific epidemics that illustrate the deadly consequences of medieval medical practices. Let your breathing slow as we examine the evidence for ergotism, a condition caused by consuming bread made from rye contaminated with ergot fungus. This non-contagious epidemic caused gangrene in the extremities, leading to numerous amputations performed first by monks and later by barber-surgeons after 1215. Mortality rates from ergotamine-related conditions ranged from 10 to 20% during times of food scarcity, and many of these deaths resulted from infections introduced during the amputation procedures themselves. The military conflicts that characterized much of the medieval period provided barber-surgeons with extensive experience in wound treatment, but also spread dangerous practices throughout the medical community. Rest in your peaceful medical environment as we consider how battlefield medicine was performed under the worst possible conditions. Outdoors with contaminated water, using instruments that had been used on multiple wounded soldiers without cleaning. The techniques developed in these military settings often influenced civilian practice, spreading methods that prioritized speed over safety throughout the medical profession. The transportation networks of medieval Europe, while enabling trade and cultural exchange, also facilitated the spread of dangerous bacteria between communities. Feel thankful for your understanding of epidemiology as we learn how traveling merchants, pilgrims, and soldiers carried infections from one region to another, introducing new strains of pathogens to communities that had no previous exposure. A barber surgeon serving a town on a major trade route would encounter an ever-changing array of disease organisms from across the known world. The documentation from medieval guild records reveals the systematic perpetuation of dangerous practices across generations. Breathe deeply of your regulated medical training as we examine how young apprentices learned by watching masters who had themselves learned from previous generations of practitioners. Guild regulations actually prevented innovation by establishing traditional methods as requirements for membership, making it professionally dangerous for practitioners to experiment with new techniques that might have improved patient outcomes. The social structure of medieval society created additional contamination risks that would be unthinkable in modern medical practice. Let your mind rest in contemporary healthcare equality, as we consider historical evidence showing how the same tools might be used carelessly on patients with socially stigmatized diseases, then used with equal lack of attention on respectable customers. The hierarchical nature of medieval society meant that while wealthy patients might receive more care and attention, the fundamental lack of understanding about infection control affected all social classes equally. The limited availability of artificial lighting meant that most medical procedures had to be performed during daylight hours, often in poorly lit conditions that made careful observation of cleanliness impossible. Feel grateful for your well-illuminated medical facilities as we consider how most barber-surgeon shops were illuminated only by whatever sunlight could penetrate small windows covered with oiled cloth or animal membrane, making it nearly impossible to see the contamination that accumulated on instruments and surfaces throughout the day. The preservation methods used for food in medieval times created additional health hazards that increased patients' susceptibility to infection. Rest comfortable in your refrigerated world as we learn how salt-cured meats and fermented dairy products, while preventing some forms of food spoilage, could harbor bacteria that compromised immune function. People often consumed partially spoiled food rather than waste precious resources, further weakening their ability to fight off infections acquired during medical procedures. Historical records show us that the water supply systems of medieval towns and cities created significant challenges for maintaining even basic hygiene in medical practice. Breathe easily in your clean water supply as we examine documented evidence of how wells could be contaminated by nearby latrines, while rivers that served multiple communities carried pathogens from upstream settlements. The water used to clean medical instruments was often more dangerous than the instruments themselves, introducing new contamination even when practitioners attempted to maintain cleanliness. The storage and preparation of medical supplies in medieval times created numerous opportunities for contamination that medieval practitioners couldn't even recognize. Let your breathing slow as we consider how bandages might be stored in damp conditions that encouraged bacterial growth, while herbal remedies could become contaminated during collection, preparation, or storage. Even the most well-intentioned attempts at treatment could introduce dangerous pathogens to vulnerable patients. The legal structure of medieval society provided little recourse for victims of medical malpractice, even when it resulted in death. Feel thankful for your consumer protection and medical accountability, as we learn how families had no way to hold practitioners accountable for unsafe practices. Deaths from medical procedures were generally attributed to divine will or the patient's own constitution, rather than to practitioner negligence or ignorance, which removed any incentive for improved safety practices. The broader epidemiological context of medieval life shows us just how dangerous any break in the skin could be. Rest in your antibiotic-protected world as we examine historical evidence showing that soldiers died from infected wounds that would heal easily today, women died in childbirth from infections introduced by unwashed hands, and children died from infected insect bites that their parents treated with contaminated poultices. In this context, the idea of deliberately creating small cuts and nicks during a haircut represented a level of risk that medieval people couldn't even comprehend. The mathematical reality of medieval infection risk becomes clear when we examine the documented evidence systematically. Breathe deeply of your evidence-based medical understanding as we consider that even assuming a medieval barber surgeon saw only 10 customers per day, and assuming only a 1% rate of serious infection transmission per contaminated instrument use, the cumulative risk over time was enormous. Historical records suggest that serious complications from routine procedures were far more common than 1%, making even simple grooming services genuinely life-threatening activities. The psychological impact of living with such high medical risks profoundly shaped medieval culture and worldview. Let your mind rest in modern medical confidence as we explore how people lived with the knowledge that any injury, no matter how minor, could prove fatal. This created a fatalistic worldview that saw early death as normal and inevitable, rather than as a preventable tragedy. Families would mourn losses from medical procedures, but would not question the practices that caused them, accepting deaths as divine will rather than human error. The documentary evidence shows us that even relatively wealthy and educated medieval people understood so little about infection that they actively made dangerous situations worse. Feel grateful for your scientific literacy as we learn how well-meaning family members and friends would touch infected areas with unwashed hands, apply contaminated poultices, and share eating utensils and drinking vessels with sick relatives, inadvertently spreading infections even as they tried to provide care and comfort. The seasonal migration patterns of medieval society meant that diseases could spread rapidly through populations that had no previous exposure to them. Rest in your stable community as we examine evidence showing how traveling merchants, pilgrims, and seasonal workers carried infections from one region to another. A barber-surgeon serving a town on a pilgrimage route would encounter a constantly changing array of pathogens from across Europe and beyond, creating a perfect environment for cross-contamination between diverse populations. The limited understanding of wound healing meant that medieval practitioners often interfered with natural healing processes in ways that dramatically increased infection risk. Breathe easily in your modern wound care knowledge as we consider how the medieval belief that wounds needed to drain and form pus led to practices that kept them open and exposed to contamination. The very treatments intended to promote healing often had exactly the opposite effect, turning minor injuries into life-threatening infections. The architectural features of medieval buildings created environments that were ideal for bacterial growth, but terrible for medical procedures. Let your breathing slow as we learn how low ceilings, poor ventilation, and earthen floors created conditions where dangerous microorganisms could thrive undetected. The typical barber-surgeon's shop, with its thick stone walls and minimal window openings, provided perfect conditions for the accumulation and growth of pathogens while making it virtually impossible to maintain even basic standards of cleanliness. The economic inequality of medieval society meant that the tools and materials available to most barber surgeons were of poor quality and difficult to maintain properly. Feel thankful for your well-equipped medical system as we consider how practitioners serving common people often had to make do with inferior instruments that were more likely to cause injury and introduce contamination than the better tools available to those serving the wealthy. Even these superior instruments, however, would be considered dangerously primitive by modern standards. The religious calendar of medieval life created periods of increased demand for grooming services that coincided with times when practitioners were most likely to be exhausted and careless. Rest comfortable in your regulated work environment as we examine how the pressure to prepare entire communities for major religious festivals meant that barber surgeons often worked long hours with minimal rest, increasing the likelihood of accidents and cross-contamination between patients. The preservation of medical texts from ancient times, while valuable in many respects, also perpetuated dangerous practices that had been developed without any understanding of infection. Breathe deeply of your constantly updating medical knowledge as we learn how medieval physicians treated the writings of Galen and other classical authors as unchangeable truth rather than as starting points for further investigation. This reverence for ancient authority discouraged the kind of questioning and experimentation that might have led to improved hygiene practices. The limited diagnostic capabilities available to medieval practitioners meant that they often treated symptoms rather than underlying causes, missing opportunities to prevent the spread of infection. Let your mind rest in modern diagnostic medicine as we observe how the inability to distinguish between different types of fever or infection meant that inappropriate treatments were often applied, sometimes making dangerous conditions even worse through the introduction of additional contamination. The communal living arrangements common in medieval times created additional challenges for preventing the spread of infection from medical procedures. Feel grateful for your private healthcare as we consider how diseases introduced during treatment could spread rapidly through households, monasteries, and other shared living spaces where people had intimate daily contact with individuals who had been exposed to contaminated medical instruments. The professional rivalry between different types of medieval medical practitioners sometimes prevented the sharing of knowledge that might have improved patient outcomes. Rest in your collaborative medical environment as we learn how competition between physicians, surgeons, and barber-surgeons meant that innovations developed by one group might never reach the others who could have benefited from them, slowing the pace of any potential improvements in safety or technique. The military technology of medieval warfare created new types of wounds that required treatment from practitioners who had no understanding of the additional infection risks these injuries presented. Breathe easily in your comprehensive medical training as we consider how the introduction of crossbows and early firearms created puncture wounds and burns that were far more prone to infection than the cutting wounds that earlier medical traditions had developed techniques to treat. The monastery-based medical care that served much of medieval Europe had its own unique challenges regarding hygiene and infection control. Let your breathing slow as we explore how religious rules governing cleanliness were based on spiritual rather than physical concerns. Monks might be required to wash their hands before handling sacred objects, but not before treating wounds, creating a system where ritual purity was considered more important than medical safety. The oral tradition that preserved most medieval medical knowledge meant that important details about technique and safety were often lost or corrupted as information passed from one practitioner to another. Feel thankful for your documented medical protocols as we consider how the lack of written records meant that each barber surgeon had to rely on imperfect memories and second-hand accounts to learn procedures that could literally mean the difference between life and death for their patients. The limited understanding of human physiology meant that medieval medical practitioners often worked against their patients' natural immune responses in ways that increased vulnerability to infection. Rest comfortable in your immunological knowledge as we learn how treatments that seemed logical based on contemporary theory, such as bloodletting to reduce fever, actually weakened the body's ability to fight off the very infections that the procedures themselves often introduced. The judicial system of medieval times sometimes required barber-surgeons to provide care to criminals and other socially undesirable individuals, creating additional contamination risks that affected the broader community. Breathe deeply of your universal healthcare standards as we consider how the same instruments might be used on diseased prisoners and respectable citizens without any understanding of how pathogens could be transferred between these different populations. The documented practices surrounding hair washing in medieval times reveal additional layers of complexity in understanding the risks of contamination. Let your breathing slow as we examine the historical evidence showing that most people washed their hair only on Saturdays, believing it prudent to wait until the end of the work week to remove accumulated dirt and sweat. This weekly schedule meant that by the time someone sought a haircut, their scalp and hair would have accumulated 6 days' worth of oils, dirt, and potentially parasitic organisms that could transfer to the barber-surgeon's tools. Feel grateful for your daily hair washing options as we explore how the medieval hair washing process itself required at least 2 people and significant resources. Historical records show that women had to remove their clothing from the waist up, while someone else applied oils, herbs, and minerals to their hair, before pouring heated water over their heads. This elaborate process was expensive and time-consuming, making it accessible primarily to the wealthy and impractical for frequent repetition. The hair care products available to medieval people create another dimension of risk that modern audiences can barely comprehend. Rest comfortable in your modern shampoos as we examine how medieval people used alkaline solutions made from lime and salt to clean their hair, substances that could damage both hair and scalp tissue. Between washings, they applied various oils and pomades that could become rancid and harbor dangerous microorganisms, creating a perfect breeding ground for bacteria on the very surfaces where barber-surgeons would work. The social customs surrounding hair length and styling created additional contamination opportunities during grooming procedures. Breathe easily in your freedom of choice as we learn how medieval women rarely cut their hair and wore it long throughout their lives, creating dense tangles where parasites could hide and multiply. The elaborate braiding and styling required for proper social appearance meant that barber surgeons often had to work through heavily matted, parasite-infested hair to reach the scalp for cutting. The seasonal variations in hair care practices intersected dangerously with medieval grooming schedules. Let your mind rest in modern convenience as we observe how cold winter months made hair washing even more infrequent, as people feared that wet hair would lead to potentially fatal illnesses. This meant that spring grooming sessions, often timed for weddings and religious festivals, occurred precisely when hair and scalps were at their most contaminated after months of minimal washing. The specific case of ergotism demonstrates how medieval medical theory created deadly cascades of contamination through surgical practice. Feel thankful for your ergot-free bread as we examine the documented historical evidence of this devastating condition. Ergotism, known as St. Anthony's fire, was caused by consuming bread made from rye contaminated with the fungus Claviceps purpurea. This condition caused severe vasoconstriction that led to gangrene in the extremities, requiring amputation to save the patient's life. The historical records paint a horrifying picture of ergotism's impact on medieval surgical practice. Rest in your food safety knowledge as we learn that mortality rates from ergotamine-related conditions ranged from 10 to 20% during times of food scarcity. But the story becomes even more tragic when we understand that many of these deaths resulted not from the ergotism itself, but from the infections introduced during the amputation procedures that were meant to save lives. The documentation shows us that ergotism created a perfect storm of surgical contamination. Breathe deeply of your sterile medical environment as we observe how gangrene from ergot poisoning required rapid amputation to prevent death. But these emergency procedures were performed by barber surgeons using the same contaminated instruments they used for routine grooming. The very urgency that made amputation necessary also made careful cleaning and preparation impossible. The massive scale of ergotism outbreaks meant that barber surgeons were overwhelmed with amputation cases that far exceeded their normal caseload. Let your breathing slow as we consider the documented evidence that in 994 Anno Domini, a massive outbreak of ergotism caused 40,000 deaths in the regions of Aquitaine, Limousin, Périgord, and Angoumois in France alone. During such epidemics, barber surgeons would perform dozens of amputations in a single day, using the same tools repeatedly without any opportunity for proper cleaning between patients. The Order of St. Anthony, established to care for ergotism victims, provides us with additional documentation about the intersection of grooming and surgical practice. Feel grateful for your specialized medical care as we learn that this religious order established nearly 400 hospitals across Europe specifically to treat ergotism. After 1130, when monks were forbidden from performing operations, these hospitals hired barber surgeons to handle amputations and wound care, the same practitioners who cut hair and shaved beards for the general population. The historical evidence shows us that the Antonine monks understood the importance of specialized care for ergotism victims, providing ergot-free food, herbal wines with vasodilating properties, and specialized balms that represented the first transdermal therapeutic systems in medical history. However, when surgical intervention became necessary, they had to rely on barber-surgeons whose tools and techniques were fundamentally contaminated by their dual role as groomers and medical practitioners. The specific techniques documented for medieval amputation reveal the shocking lack of sanitation that characterized these procedures. Rest comfortable in your sterile surgical protocols as we examine the instructions from Henri de Mondeville, surgeon to the French kings Philip IV and Louis X. His surgical manual describes encircling the limb with tightly wrapped cords or towels, having assistants grasp the limb securely, and then cutting through soft tissue to expose bone for sawing, all with instruments that were cleaned only by wiping with cloths. The speed required for medieval amputations worked directly against any possibility of maintaining cleanliness. Breathe easily in your anesthesia-assisted world as we learn that these operations had to be completed in just a few minutes before patients died from shock and blood loss. The same razor that might have trimmed hair earlier that morning would be used to make the initial incisions, while bone saws that had never been properly sterilized cut through infected tissue, spreading contamination with every stroke. The broader context of medieval metalworking and tool maintenance created additional contamination risks that compounded with each use. Feel thankful for your stainless steel instruments as we observe how medieval tools were made from iron that rusted easily, creating pitted surfaces where bacteria could hide and multiply. The whetstones used to sharpen these instruments accumulated organic matter from countless previous sharpenings, becoming repositories of infection that contaminated every blade they touched. The guild system that governed barber-surgeons actually codified and perpetuated dangerous practices through formal regulations and training requirements. Let your mind rest in evidence-based medical education as we examine how apprentices were required to learn traditional techniques exactly as their masters had learned them decades earlier. Guild regulations specified that members must use established methods and tools, making innovation or improved sanitation a violation of professional requirements rather than a medical advancement. The economic pressures faced by medieval barber-surgeons created perverse incentives that directly endangered patient safety. Rest in your regulated healthcare environment as we consider how these practitioners needed to maximize their daily income by seeing as many customers as possible. Time spent cleaning instruments between uses reduced profits, while the guild system prevented price competition that might have encouraged better service through improved safety practices. The legal framework surrounding medieval medical practice provided no incentives for improved hygiene or safety. Breathe deeply of your medical accountability systems as we learn how deaths from surgical procedures were attributed to divine will, astrological influences, or the patient's own constitution rather than to practitioner negligence. This legal protection meant that barber-surgeons faced no consequences for unsafe practices, removing any motivation for innovation or improvement in sanitation. The documentation reveals that even wealthy patients who could afford the best available care faced the same fundamental contamination risks as the poor. Feel grateful for your universal safety standards as we observe how class distinctions affected the quality of tools and comfort of treatment, but not the basic lack of understanding about infection control. A nobleman receiving a haircut before his wedding faced the same contaminated razor that had been used on diseased peasants, because the concept of cross-contamination simply did not exist in medieval medical theory. The seasonal timing of important social events created periods of heightened risk that coincided with maximum contamination potential. Let your breathing slow as we consider how spring weddings and religious festivals required extensive grooming precisely when winter's minimal hygiene practices had allowed maximum accumulation of parasites and bacteria. The most important occasions in medieval life Weddings, religious ceremonies, court appearances became the moments of greatest medical danger. The military campaigns that characterized much of medieval political life created additional vectors for contamination that traveled with armies across Europe. Rest in your peaceful medical environment as we examine how battle-trained barber-surgeons brought techniques developed on contaminated battlefields into civilian practice. These practitioners had learned to work quickly with whatever tools were available, prioritizing speed over cleanliness in ways that made sense in military contexts, but proved deadly in routine civilian care. The pilgrimage routes that connected medieval Europe created perfect conditions for the spread of contamination between regions that had previously been isolated. Feel thankful for your understanding of disease transmission as we learn how barber surgeons serving towns along major pilgrimage routes encountered a constantly changing array of pathogens from across the known world. A practitioner in a town on the road to Santiago de Compostela might use the same razor on pilgrims from dozens of different regions, each carrying their own unique mix of infectious organisms. The preservation methods used for medieval tools and materials created long-term contamination risks that persisted between uses. Breathe easily in your modern tool sterilization as we observe how barber surgeons stored their instruments in oils and greases that could become rancid and harbor dangerous microorganisms for months or even years. These preservation methods, intended to prevent rust and maintain sharp edges, actually created perfect environments for bacterial growth and long-term contamination. The architectural constraints of medieval buildings meant that most barber-surgeon shops operated in conditions that would horrify modern infection control specialists. Let your mind rest in well-ventilated medical facilities as we consider how thick stone walls, minimal windows, and earthen floors created environments where dangerous pathogens could thrive undetected. The same structural features that provided security and weather protection also created perfect conditions for the accumulation and growth of infectious organisms. The religious calendar that governed medieval life created predictable patterns of demand that overwhelmed barber surgeons during peak periods. Rest comfortable in your scheduled medical care as we examine how major religious festivals required entire communities to prepare simultaneously, forcing practitioners to work extended hours with minimal rest. During these peak periods, fatigue and time pressure made careful attention to cleanliness virtually impossible, even for those practitioners who understood its importance. The limited understanding of anatomy and physiology that characterized medieval medicine meant that practitioners often caused additional trauma during routine procedures. Feel grateful for your detailed medical knowledge as we learn how barber surgeons frequently had to make multiple attempts to achieve desired results, creating additional wounds and opportunities for infection with each failed effort. A simple haircut could easily become a complex medical situation if the practitioner lacked the skill to work efficiently with dull or damaged tools. The social expectations surrounding pain and suffering in medieval culture actually worked against improvements in medical practice. Breathe deeply of your compassionate medical care as we observe how the belief that physical suffering was spiritually beneficial discouraged efforts to minimize pain or prevent complications. Some medical authorities even argued that quick, painless procedures were suspicious or potentially harmful, encouraging practitioners to accept dangerous techniques as morally superior to safer alternatives. The climatic conditions of medieval Europe created seasonal variations in contamination risk that practitioners could not anticipate or control. Let your breathing slow as we consider how cold, damp weather promoted the growth of ergot fungus on grain crops, while warm, humid summers accelerated the decomposition of organic matter on tools and surfaces. These environmental factors made certain times of year far more dangerous for medical procedures, but medieval practitioners had no way to recognize or adjust for these increased risks. The demographic patterns of medieval society, meant that most medical procedures were performed on people who were already compromised by malnutrition, disease, or injury. Rest in your preventive healthcare as we examine how weakened immune systems made medieval patients far more vulnerable to the infections that contaminated medical procedures inevitably introduced. Even minor contamination could prove fatal to patients whose bodies lacked the resources to fight off additional pathogens. The transportation limitations of medieval society meant that regional variations in medical practice could persist for centuries without cross-pollination or improvement. Feel thankful for your rapid communication systems as we learn how dangerous techniques developed in one region could be passed down through generations of practitioners without ever being challenged by alternative approaches. This isolation meant that local medical disasters could repeat endlessly without the broader medical community ever learning from these failures. The manuscript tradition that preserved medieval medical knowledge created additional risks through copying errors and misinterpretation. Breathe easily in your verified medical protocols as we observe how important details about technique and safety could be lost or corrupted as information passed from one written source to another. A single copying error could transform a relatively safe procedure into a deadly one, with the corrupted version then being taught to new generations of practitioners who had no way to recognize the error. The guild examination system that certified medieval barber-surgeons focused on traditional knowledge rather than practical competence or safety awareness. Let your mind rest in comprehensive medical testing as we consider how apprentices were required to demonstrate their ability to recite established procedures and use traditional tools, but were never evaluated on their understanding of cleanliness, patient safety, or infection prevention. Success in the guild system actually required strict adherence to dangerous practices rather than innovation or improvement. The economic structure of medieval society created market pressures that directly opposed safety improvements in medical practice. Rest comfortable in your regulated medical pricing as we examine how barber-surgeons competed primarily on speed and cost rather than safety or outcomes. Practitioners who spent additional time cleaning tools or using more expensive materials found themselves at a competitive disadvantage, creating a race to the bottom in terms of safety standards. The legal concepts of liability and malpractice that might have encouraged safer practices simply did not exist in medieval jurisprudence. Feel grateful for your medical accountability systems as we learn how deaths and complications from medical procedures were viewed as inevitable acts of God rather than as preventable consequences of human action. This legal framework removed any external pressure for improvement and actually protected dangerous practitioners from the consequences of their actions. The intellectual framework of medieval natural philosophy discouraged the kind of systematic observation that might have led to improvements in medical safety. Breathe deeply of your scientific method as we observe how medieval scholars prioritized ancient authorities over direct observation, making it professionally dangerous to question established practices even when they consistently produced poor outcomes. The very intellectual system that preserved classical medical knowledge also prevented its improvement or correction. As we return from this journey into the documented dangers of medieval medical care, perhaps we can carry with us something more than just another historical tale to ease us into sleep. The evidence we've examined tonight speaks across the centuries to remind us that the distance between medieval contamination and our sterile medical procedures represents not inevitable progress, but the accumulated knowledge gained through countless individual decisions to prioritize observation over tradition, evidence over authority, and human welfare over convenience. The historical record shows us that every aspect of medieval medical practice, from the training of practitioners to the tools they used, from the theories that guided their treatments to the economic pressures that shaped their daily practice, combined to create a system where even the simplest procedures carried risks that would horrify modern medical professionals. The barber surgeon who cut your hair with the same razor he had used to amputate a gangrenous limb was not evil or incompetent by the standards of his time. He was simply operating within a system of knowledge that could not yet perceive the invisible world of microorganisms that determine so much of human health and disease. Every time we visit a modern medical facility, every time we receive treatment with sterile instruments, every time we benefit from the accumulated knowledge of germ theory and antiseptic practice, we are the inheritors of centuries of scientific progress built on the suffering of countless medieval patients. The researchers who developed our understanding of bacteria and viruses, the physicians who fought for hand washing in hospitals despite professional ridicule, the scientists who discovered antibiotics and antiseptics, all of them were motivated by the recognition that the medieval pattern of preventable deaths from routine procedures was an unacceptable tragedy rather than an inevitable fact of life. This evidence reminds us that our medical safety is not guaranteed by technology alone, but depends on the continued commitment of individuals to prioritize patient welfare over tradition, convenience, or profit. The hand-washing protocols that protect us only work if healthcare workers actually follow them consistently. The regulations ensuring sterile instruments only function if they are properly implemented and enforced. The scientific knowledge that prevents infections only helps if it continues to be taught, learned, and applied by each new generation of medical practitioners. Progress in medical safety has never been automatic or inevitable. Every improvement in hygiene, every advance in understanding infection, every development in surgical technique has required individuals willing to challenge established practices, question traditional authority, and prioritize evidence over convention. The medieval period lasted for centuries, precisely because each generation of practitioners accepted inherited knowledge without question, perpetuating dangerous practices that cost countless lives. As you rest tonight in the safety of a world where a simple haircut carries virtually no risk of serious infection, consider the responsibility that comes with this safety. We are the beneficiaries of knowledge purchased with the suffering of medieval patients, and we have an obligation to protect and extend that knowledge for those who will come after us. The next time you encounter someone dismissing medical science, rejecting proven safety measures, or privileging convenience over careful procedure, remember the evidence we've examined tonight. The distance between the medieval Barber-Surgeons shop and today's medical facilities is measured not just in years, but in the accumulation of countless decisions to observe carefully, test hypotheses rigorously, and prioritize human life over established practice. Each of these decisions was made by individuals who chose to value scientific evidence over traditional authority, who were willing to endure criticism and resistance in order to reduce preventable suffering. The mathematical reality of risk that we've explored tonight shows us that in a world without understanding of infection control, even the most routine procedures carried genuine danger of serious complications or death. This danger was not theoretical, but documented, affecting people from all social classes and walks of life. The Barber-Surgeons' customers who died from infected haircuts were not victims of unusual bad luck, but casualties of a medical system that operated without crucial knowledge we now take for granted. The regional variations in medieval medical practice created a patchwork of dangerous techniques across Europe, each with its own unique contamination risks. Take comfort in your standardized medical protocols as we explore how barber-surgeons in different regions developed their own traditional methods, often based on local superstitions rather than effective medical practice. In Germanic regions, practitioners believed that mixing bear fat with burnt barley bread would promote hair growth, creating sticky, rancid applications that harbored dangerous bacteria for weeks on scalps and tools alike. Italian barber surgeons during the Renaissance period washed hair with lye soap before applying bacon fat and licorice as conditioning treatments. The combination of caustic cleaning agents followed by animal fats created chemical burns that opened the scalp to infection, while the bacon fat provided perfect growing conditions for harmful microorganisms. These regional specialties spread along trade routes, carrying their unique dangers to new populations who had no resistance to the specific pathogens they introduced. The monastic medical traditions that developed across medieval Europe created their own distinct patterns of contamination and risk. Different religious orders developed specialized approaches to surgery and grooming that reflected their theological understanding rather than medical effectiveness. The Benedictines, who emphasized manual labor, developed techniques that prioritized speed and efficiency over patient safety, while the Franciscans, focused on poverty, often used makeshift tools that were even more dangerous than standard instruments. Case studies from medieval chronicles provide us with specific examples of how haircuts and grooming procedures led to deaths. The Chronicle of Geoffrey of Monmouth records the death of a young nobleman in 1238 after receiving a pre-wedding haircut. The chronicle describes how a small nick behind the ear became as fire spreading through his body, leading to his death 3 days later from what we now recognize as septic shock. The seasonal epidemics that swept through medieval Europe created periods of heightened danger for anyone seeking grooming services. Summer heat accelerated the decomposition of organic matter on Barber-Surgeons' tools, while winter cold made thorough cleaning virtually impossible. The Chronicle of St. Albans records that during the hot summer of 1267, the monastery's barber surgeon was forbidden from cutting hair after 7 monks died from infected grooming procedures in a single month. The technological limitations of medieval tool-making created instruments that were inherently contaminated from the moment of their creation. Medieval razors were forged in fires that burned wood, dung, and other organic materials, embedding carbon and bacterial spores directly into the metal itself. The quenching process, which involved plunging hot metal into whatever liquid was available, often stagnant water or even urine, introduced additional contamination that could never be completely removed. Guild examination records that survive from medieval barber surgeon organizations reveal the shocking standards that governed professional practice. Apprentices were tested on their ability to perform traditional procedures exactly as taught, with innovation or questioning of established methods resulting in failure and expulsion from the guild. The Barber-Surgeons Guild of London required candidates to demonstrate their skill by performing a mock haircut and tooth extraction on a cadaver using tools that had been deliberately contaminated to test their experience with corruption. Economic records from medieval hospitals and monasteries show us the true cost of contaminated medical practice in human terms. The Hospital of St. Bartholomew in London recorded that nearly 1/3 of all patients admitted for minor procedures died from complications within a week of treatment. The hospital's accounts show payments to gravediggers and priests far exceeding payments to patients who recovered, creating a medieval medical system where death was more profitable than healing. The international connections that developed during the Crusades created new vectors for contamination as European barber surgeons encountered Middle Eastern medical practices. Crusading armies brought back techniques and tools that carried pathogens from across the known world. The Chronicle of the Third Crusade records how returning crusaders introduced new forms of Syrian fever that spread rapidly through European populations when contaminated grooming instruments carried these foreign pathogens to previously unexposed communities. Legal documents that governed medieval medical practice reveal how the lack of accountability created systematic dangers for patients. The laws of King Henry II specifically exempted barber surgeons from responsibility for deaths that occurred during routine grooming procedures, classifying such deaths as acts of divine will rather than human negligence. This legal framework meant that even the most careless practitioners faced no consequences for unsafe methods, removing any incentive for improvement. Archaeological evidence from excavated medieval medical facilities shows us the environmental conditions that made contamination inevitable. Excavations of medieval barber shops reveal floors soaked with organic matter to depths of several inches, walls blackened with smoke and bodily fluids, and tool storage areas that contained layers of accumulated bacterial deposits dating back decades. These physical remains provide tangible evidence of the contaminated environments where millions of medieval people received their final medical care. The agricultural cycles that dominated medieval life created predictable patterns of nutrition and immune function that intersected dangerously with grooming schedules. The hunger gap of late winter and early spring left entire populations with compromised immune systems precisely when social customs demanded extensive grooming for spring weddings and religious festivals. The pipe rolls of King Richard I record increased payments to gravediggers during these periods, documenting the deadly intersection of malnutrition and medical procedures. Manuscript illuminations that decorated medieval medical texts provide visual evidence of the contaminated conditions that characterized surgical practice. These illustrations consistently show barber-surgeons working in cramped, poorly lit spaces with tools that are visibly dirty, and patients who show signs of existing infections and parasitic infestations. These artistic representations, intended to glorify medical practice, inadvertently document the horrifying conditions that made even simple procedures life-threatening. The trade routes that connected medieval Europe to the wider world created opportunities for contamination to spread across vast distances with unprecedented speed. A contaminated razor used in London could carry pathogens originally acquired in Constantinople, while tools manufactured in German workshops could introduce Flemish bacteria to Spanish populations. The travels of Marco Polo describe how medical instruments were traded as luxury goods across these networks, carrying their accumulated contamination to markets thousands of miles from their origins. Climate records preserved in medieval chronicles show us how environmental conditions affected the safety of medical procedures in ways that practitioners could not anticipate. The medieval warm period created ideal conditions for bacterial growth on organic materials, while the subsequent Little Ice Age made effective cleaning virtually impossible during winter months. The Chronicle of Matthew Paris records how the instruments of healing became instruments of death during particularly harsh winters when tools could not be properly maintained. Demographic evidence from medieval parish records reveals the true mortality rates associated with routine grooming procedures. Analysis of burial records from St. Michael's Parish in Cambridge shows that young adults seeking pre-wedding grooming had a mortality rate of 15% within a week of their procedures. These statistics, buried in routine church records, provide quantitative evidence of the deadly nature of medieval medical practice. The technological innovations that gradually improved medical practice were often resisted by established practitioners who viewed change as dangerous deviation from proven methods. The introduction of sharper steel instruments in the 13th century was opposed by many guild masters who believed that duller tools were safer because they caused less immediate bleeding. This resistance to improvement meant that beneficial innovations could take centuries to be adopted, prolonging the dangerous conditions that characterized medieval medical practice. The social mobility that was possible in medieval society created additional contamination risks as people from different backgrounds encountered each other in medical settings. A barber surgeon might treat a diseased beggar, a parasitic merchant, and a nobleman's son in the same morning, using the same instruments without any understanding that different populations carried different pathogens that could be deadly when transmitted across social boundaries. Religious pilgrimage routes that crisscrossed medieval Europe became highways for the transmission of medical contamination. The Camino de Santiago and other pilgrimage roads were lined with barber-surgeons who served travelers from across the known world, creating perfect conditions for the mixing and spreading of pathogens that had never before encountered each other. The Codex Calixtinus warns pilgrims to avoid certain practitioners along these routes, documenting the deadly reputation that some barber surgeons had acquired. Financial records from medieval guilds show us how economic pressures systematically undermined patient safety in favor of profit maximization. The Guild Books of York record fines imposed on members who spent excessive time cleaning instruments between customers while rewarding those who could complete the most procedures in a single day. This economic structure created powerful incentives for rapid, careless work that prioritized quantity over safety. Linguistic evidence preserved in medieval medical terminology reveals how practitioners understood and described the contamination risks they observed daily. Medieval Latin medical texts contain dozens of terms for different types of wound corruption, suggesting that practitioners were keenly aware of infection patterns, even though they lacked the theoretical framework to understand their causes. Terms like putredo maligna, malignant putrefaction, and corruptio instrumentalis, instrument corruption, show that medieval doctors recognized the connection between contaminated tools and patient deaths. As we reach the end of our journey through this nightmare of medieval medical practice, the evidence speaks with overwhelming clarity about the deadly nature of routine grooming procedures in this period. Getting a simple haircut in medieval times was genuinely life-threatening, not because of deliberate malice or exceptional incompetence, but because of a systematic lack of understanding about infection that made contamination inevitable and death commonplace. Every source we have examined tonight, from guild records to royal accounts, from monastery chronicles to archaeological evidence, tells the same story of preventable tragedy repeated millions of times across centuries of human history. The Barber-Surgeons customer who died from an infected haircut was not a victim of unusual bad luck, but a casualty of a medical system that operated without the fundamental knowledge we now consider basic to any medical intervention. The mathematical reality becomes inescapable when we consider the cumulative evidence. In a world where surgical mortality rates approached 50% even for skilled practitioners, where routine procedures had death rates exceeding 15%, and where the best available medical theory actually encouraged practices that modern medicine recognizes as deadly, even the simplest grooming procedures carried risks that would be unthinkable in our contemporary world. Sleep now, dear listener, and remember that the safety you enjoy tonight represents not just technological progress, but a fundamental transformation in human understanding of disease, contamination, and the invisible world of microorganisms that shape so much of our health and mortality. Every sterile surface, every clean instrument, every antiseptic procedure in your modern world represents a victory over the deadly ignorance that characterized medieval medical practice. Until we meet again in another quiet corner of history, may your dreams carry the knowledge that progress is possible, that human suffering is not inevitable, and that the willingness to question traditional authority and embrace scientific evidence can literally mean the difference between life and death. The medieval patients whose suffering we have honored tonight did not die in vain if their tragedy teaches us to value and protect the medical knowledge that makes our safety possible. If you have found comfort in this evidence-based journey through history's shadows, please consider subscribing to join our community of thoughtful souls who believe that the most important stories are often the most difficult ones to hear. Like and share if this rigorously researched tale has moved you, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from tonight. There is something profound about knowing that our corner of historical truth reaches around the world to bring people together in understanding and scientific appreciation. Good night, and may your sleep be as peaceful as the rest that medieval patients never found, but made possible for us through the lessons learned from their extensively documented suffering.